Victoria, you want to kick us off?
Great. Yes, thank you, Amy, and thank you everybody for attending. We're very excited to be here with you. And we'll be talking about the 2024 presidential and congressional elections and what we can expect from the healthcare legislative, regulatory, and even judicial landscape. And I know all of you are familiar with Amy and myself since we've had a chance to work with you all. But we do have two of our colleagues joining us. And so I would love to maybe start with introductions. As you know, I'm Victoria Hamsha, and I'm an associate in the DC office of K&L Gates. We're specialized in public policy and law and healthcare policy in specific.
Thanks, Victoria. I'll introduce myself, Amy Carnevale. I'm a government affairs advisor in the public policy group at K&L Gates.
And I'm Andy Ruskin, also with Victoria here in DC. And I am in the healthcare and FDA practice group, and I specialize in Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement compliance, the Administrative Procedure Act, litigation against the government, as well as 340B. I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you. I'm Amanda Smith. I recently joined K&L Gates back in August. My voice is a little hoarse because I recovered from bronchitis. I'm not sick, but I apologize for the raspiness. And so prior to joining K&L Gates back in August, I spent the previous decade at 340B Health, which is a hospital association that focuses exclusively on 340B. So I am a counsel in the healthcare and FDA practice group, and looking forward to joining today's webinar.
Thanks, Amanda. Victoria, do you want to run through the agenda, and then I'll give the overview on the political landscape?
Definitely. Thank you, Julie. Could you next slide, please? Thank you. So as we mentioned, we'll be talking about the presidential and congressional elections and what they could be on key policy areas, and as well as what it can moving ahead. But I think it's always helpful, just to get a sense of where we are and how we got here. And so Amy will be providing just a brief overview of, just what's been happening up to now and what we can expect with the elections coming up in just a couple of weeks.
Thanks. Next slide. Next slide. Great. So it's certainly been a historic year, in what has been a number of historic years, really, when we think about both congressional and presidential elections. So we just thought, just quickly, we would review how we got to the current situation. And of course, looking back on this year, we started early this year with Congress returning with a packed agenda, with a top priority of government funding. The president gave a State of the Union address, and in March, a Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was actually funding the fiscal year, which had started the September or October 1st previous, was enacted in March. So certainly quite late, which has been the norm in recent years in Congress. After the funding passed, really all eyes turned to the election cycle, both congressional and presidential. Next slide. So certainly this summer, focusing on the presidential race, we had the historic debate in June, followed shortly thereafter by the first of two assassination attempts against former President Trump. That was just the weekend before the RNC met in Milwaukee. I happened to be out in Milwaukee during that weekend. And if you think about how much the race has changed since then, it's really quite historic and amazing. The thought at that time was the Republicans were kind of running on a high, that following that debate, President Biden was thought to be a weakened candidate. He was refusing to leave the race, and we thought that was the state of the race. So of course, Senator J.D. Vance was chosen as the VP candidate at that convention, and then shortly thereafter, President Biden announced that he would in fact not seek re-election, setting up Kamala Harris as the nominee on the Democratic side. And of course, she selected Tim Walz as her running mate. Momentum continuing with the DNC. Certainly, the DNC was an opportunity for Democrats really to unite, and messaging coming out of that convention was all positive for a number of weeks. And it seemed like the Republicans were really on their heels. Debate ensued, and really, I would say, not much changed following the debate between Vice President Harris and President Trump. It went, I would say, probably as expected. No major faux pas for President Trump, as Republicans thought there might be or could be, and Vice President Harris certainly did a good job delivering the message on the Democratic side. And that brings us really to this month. Early voting has started. Congress is now in a continuing funding resolution. They adjourned a little bit earlier than expected, as a matter of fact, to focus on campaigning and elections. And we had the vice presidential debate, which I think most people thought that Senator J.D. Vance did a good job in that debate, but as did his counterpart too. So really, I think it didn't change a lot. And of course, vice presidential candidates tend not to matter very much in the scheme of things. People tend to vote on the presidential side and not the vice presidential side. And I would just say, at this current time, we don't have a bullet for it, but the hurricanes, are we always talk about the October surprise and what's going to happen in October. And sometimes it's a scandal. Sometimes it's something that's planned to be released in October. But at this point, I would say the hurricanes are really proving to be that October surprise. And of course, thinking about the response in Western North Carolina and how either the current administration under Harris reacted to that, or Donald Trump, whether he went too far in his criticism, and how that's perceived will be, I think, the days and weeks headed into the election will tell, and could be a contributing factor in North Carolina, which is a key election state, which we'll talk about next. So next slide. Okay, so the presidential election, the last one was incredibly close, and all polling and all accounts lead us to believe that this one will be too. We don't think the election will be probably known for a couple of days, if not weeks. I had a dinner with former presidential candidate Asa Hutchinson last night, and we were talking about the Republican National Committee and when the election of the new chairman will be, which will be January. And he said, well, good. Well, at least by that point, we'll know who our president will be. And so it kind of startled me to think, okay, we may not know till January, but I tend to think it'll be sooner than that. I'm one of many who just hopes that we'll have certainty once the ballots are counted. But it's certainly close. Next slide. And you've probably seen on the news, it's coming down to 7 states. We talked a little bit about North Carolina already. Recent polling tends to favor the Republicans in North Carolina, but that could very well prove to be the swing state. Pennsylvania is also incredibly close. The polling has gone back and forth between the Republican side, the Democratic side. Nevada, also a close state, as well as Georgia. Georgia, you could easily see counting for days, if not weeks. And of course, we all remember the recounts in the 2 Senate races just a couple of years ago. Michigan and Wisconsin, I think both tend to favor the Democrats, but again, they're still within the margin of error, and Republicans are competing for those states. And Arizona has a Senate race as well as close on the presidential as well. So that's an interesting state to follow. Next slide, please. Next slide. Congressional elections. So I'll start with the House side. So of course, Republicans control the House of Representatives currently. Extraordinarily close. honestly, in looking at the House elections, it could go either way. I think anybody who tells you that they know what's going to happen is lying or likes to think that they know what's going to happen. I would say if you talk to kind of odds makers, more people than not tend to think it's maybe leans on more on the Democratic side. But again, I tend to think that it's probably going to go the way the presidential goes. If we see a Republican president, that tends to sweep in some of those districts that are borderline or could go either way. But again, it's when you look at it, we have 25 open Democratic seats to 21 open Republican. So extraordinarily close. Next slide. And on the Senate side, so the Senate, most people do think that Republicans will regain control of Senate. Of course, the Senate's currently in control of the Democrats. So that's generally thought to be a flip, with West Virginia, the seat that will almost certainly go into Republican hands. And Democrats, just on the basis of numbers, if you look at the seats that they're defending versus Republicans, they have 23 seats that they're defending versus 11 current Republican seats. So just on the basis of that alone, and given the almost certain switch in West Virginia, it does look like the U.S. Senate will switch over to the Republican side. Next slide. And so that's a little bit of an overview. And I just say on the presidential, I'll let Victoria take it over at this point, because I know we want to talk a little bit, get into more detail on healthcare. But just as we're thinking about control in Congress and in committees, I'll just note over in the Senate Health Committee, we do have two senators, both are the chairman and the ranking minority member, who are not retiring. So we would expect if the Senate does flip, we would just have a switch there from Sanders to Cassidy as chair. And generally, they have had a communicated well, I would say, not always agreeing certainly on policy positions, but at least had an open communication on the Senate side. On the House side, in terms of leadership on key committees, we will have some changes because of retirements, and at least on energy and commerce, there's a competition on the Republican side for either chair or ranking member of that committee, with Congressman Guthrie and Congressman Latta are the two Republicans who are competing for that position. Most people think that Guthrie probably has an edge, but Latta has more seniority on the committee. So that's the competition there. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Victoria, and I know we do want to leave time at the end for plenty of questions. Victoria.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so we thought that it would be helpful to maybe go over potential implications on key issue areas. And obviously, top of mind is the Affordable Care Act. Enacted during the Biden administration. The law has survived a number of legal challenges and attempts from Congress to repeal and replace the entire law or aspects of the law. But most interesting perhaps is at the regulatory level, because as you know, a lot of the implementing regulations have been in flux as the Trump administration sought to make certain changes through the law, through the regulatory process, which right now are continue to make their way through court. And the Biden administration has reinstated several of those interpretations of the law as originally enacted, issuing key regulations, just this year and last year on preventive services and non-discrimination and a couple of other areas. And so I think high level, and this is probably something that you've just been seeing on the news, I think the key question is what could potentially happen to the Affordable Care Act? And can we really expect an effort to repeal and replace the entire law? And, obviously, Harris administration is largely expected to continue to build on the law and defend it from legal challenges. And as expressed in the Democratic platform, the Republican platform does not mention the Affordable Care Act, but it does note that Republicans will promote choice and competition. And so I think at least, if some of the ideas from the Republican Study Committee, which is the Congressional Caucus of conservative members of the Republican Party. They've laid out some of their priorities and proposed budgets. And I think one of the things that would be more likely to be expected in a Republican administration would be perhaps changes or the elimination of some of the subsidies and the expansion of other forms of insurance, especially those favoring employer-sponsored insurance, like health savings accounts, and some others like association health plans and health reimbursement arrangements and the like. As to the likelihood of a more comprehensive healthcare reform, that is still, that's still something that people are awaiting more details. I mean, I think there's been references to a plan, a potential plan or a concept of a plan to do something with healthcare more broadly, but that is something that we would need to just wait and see. The one thing that is interesting before we move on is, on a Harris administration, whether there could be renewed calls for something along the lines of Medicare for all. As you know, in some of her previous platforms, and even during her time in Congress, she has endorsed some forms of Medicare for all options, particularly those that would build on Medicare Advantage. And so that is something that I think would be of interest. But again, the likelihood of any of that happening, particularly very comprehensive reforms, would depend on the composition of Congress. Next slide, please. And I think another big picture area is obviously the future of Medicare, because it doesn't matter, who ends up in office. I think the incoming administration will very much need to address the long-term health and viability of the Medicare Trust Fund. And I think on the Democratic side, it's interesting because even despite the current status of Medicare and the long-term health of the program, there are calls to build on the program. I think you just probably saw on the news just yesterday, Vice President Harris proposed to expand Medicare coverage to certain vision and hearing services, in addition to a long-term care at home benefit for the program. And I think it's my understanding, traditional Medicare currently doesn't cover vision services, except for, I think, just one pair of eyeglasses or contact lenses after cataract surgery. And Part B also cover diagnostic hearing and balance exams that are ordered by a provider in certain hospital services when they're part of some surgically implanted device or the like. But hearing aids and exams are otherwise not covered. And I think right now the issue is obviously cost. The CBO had assessed previous proposals to expand coverage of some of these new benefits, and a full expansion would cost $358 billion over 10 years, which is very expensive. So the likelihood of any of this happening would really depend on whether we could actually pay for it. And as we'll go into detail, we do expect tax reform to be top priority coming up. And so something like this is very unlikely to happen, short term. On the Republican side, there are statements that Republicans will protect Medicare and obviously try to address the long-term health of the program. But I think for our purposes, immediate short term, I think what there is potential for on a bipartisan basis is discrete measures that could control cost for the program. And for us, that is a big risk is obviously the implementation of site neutral payment policies. We saw this with the Lower Cost, More Transparency Act, which passed the House. And we're seeing it right now with efforts to move some version of that transparency bill as part of government funding later in the year. And just this week, there was also starting to be some rumors and some press about Senator Cassidy and Hassan on starting negotiations on a broad site-neutral reform legislation. Again, this would not be the discrete measures of the Lower Cost, More Transparency Act. They're envisioning a broad reform legislation on site-neutral. And this is not something that, we would expect to even be introduced or move this Congress. But looking ahead, that is, where the thoughts are going. And as Amy mentioned, if Senator Cassidy were to be in the majority in the Senate, this would pose a bigger risk for us. And the reason for a lot of that is because right now, I'm not sure if the CBO has actually studied a broad site-neutral reform legislation, but there's been studies that it could save up to $471 billion. And the understanding, I think, right now is that they were exempt rural hospitals because there's been some of the concerns that have been voiced about the potential impact on those. So that is something that we're obviously going to be watching for, and we'll keep you all updated. But again, this is just more than big picture ACA or big picture Medicare changes. I think for our purposes, this is something that could very well move, and so we need to stay alert and be active on. Next slide, please. And so and I included this about what about Medicaid? I'm not sure. I assume most of you are following, the healthcare press and some of the news out there. There's a lot of chat about, some of the key issues we've been talking about: ACA, Medicare, drug pricing, reproductive health. But there hasn't been much on Medicaid. It is not in the platforms. And it's the largest public insurer, and it's a big part of our healthcare spending. And so a big question is, what could happen to Medicaid? And obviously, Vice President Harris has in the past advocated for Medicaid expansion and expanding coverage as well. Postpartum being a good example of something that she advocated for a long time before a lot of the states started to move in that direction. As well as ways to facilitate enrollment and eligibility for the program. And as you know, former President Trump has supported the implementation of certain work requirements for non-disabled recipients, as well as other types of cost savings measures. But in either scenario, obviously, this is a program that is also administered by the states. And so the incoming administration would, rely on some of the Medicaid Section 1115 waivers and work with the states on bringing about, these types of changes to the program. And so that is one area where we may see some of this activity. Next slide, please. And one topic that has been getting a lot of attention, and mostly because of the anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act, is prescription drug pricing. As you all know, the Inflation Reduction Act implemented a lot of key changes in the drug pricing space. It allowed Medicare to negotiate the prices for select drugs with drug manufacturers. It put an inflation cap on certain drugs and capped insulin prescriptions for Medicare beneficiaries and annual out-of-pocket drug costs for beneficiaries as well. And so there's been an effort on the Democratic side, and also highlighted in the Democratic platform, to continuing to build on the Inflation Reduction Act by accelerating some of these Medicare negotiations and expanding the drugs that are currently part of the negotiations, and also expanding the caps that are right now beyond Medicare and into the commercial market. And one thing that I thought was so interesting just from this morning, you may have seen it on Politico, was that the CBO released a report. Because obviously there's just been a lot of speculation about the potential impact of all of this, and from the Democratic side. And the CBO actually estimated that including more drugs each year would reduce average drug prices in 2031 by 0.1%, up to 3%. And extending those to the commercial purchasers would result in prices that are 1 to 3% lower. And the reason this is interesting is because of the contrast to the Republican platform. Obviously, the platform notes that Republicans will oppose some of the negotiation and some of what they perceive as price controls. But the question is, what could they do the alternative. And so a lot of attention has been on, some of the previous plans of President Trump to try to do an international reference pricing model, right? That would base, a lot of these prices on other countries. And this is something that, back in 2020, and Andy, I think you and I may have worked on this at that time, because I remember working with you on this. There was a big executive order that, attempted to make some of these changes, and which was ultimately rescinded, in the Biden administration, and I think ended up going to the courts, and it just ultimately ended up being halted. But one thing that's interesting about this CBO report from, I think, yesterday or today is that they expected that the international reference pricing policy to reduce prices in 2031 by more than 5%. So almost like the double the amount as, some of these IRA policies. And so right now there's a lot of questions about whether this is something that the Republican a party would favor. Former President Trump has not made a statement, and in fact has, just given the impact it would have on the pharmaceutical industry, has shied away from fully endorsing this type of model again. And I think he's saying that there's no push right now to renew that kind of conversation or something. But who knows? The CBO score, again, may renew some of these discussions in the future. Next slide, please. The other topic is, when it comes to drug pricing, is the role of pharmacy benefit managers. And I know you all, deal closely with them. I think, as you know, there's a lot of emphasis right now in Congress in studying, and in the administration, in studying the role of pharmacy benefit managers in the industry, and as well as their practices, and the impact that has on the care and services that are provided. And this really follows the actions of a number of states. I mean, I think I saw, according to the National Academy of State Health Policy, all 50 states now have enacted some sort of PBM regulation legislation, and trying to address some of this. And it really spans the whole spectrum. Some of these laws are very comprehensive, providing for licensure and oversight. I think there's a growing number of states that have enacted laws requiring the PBMs to be licensed or registered with some sort of state agency before they can, do business in the state. And some of the laws also require disclosure of rebate and other type of information to plans or the state. And they also prohibit certain actions by PBMs. I think right now over 40 states have enacted laws that prohibit them from subjecting their pharmacies to gag clauses. So meaning that the PBM's contract with the pharmacy could not prevent the pharmacy employees from disclosing certain drug pricing information to patients, for instance. And there's also an attempt to prohibit what's known as spread pricing, which means the PBM would not be able to charge the plan more for outpatient drugs than the amount that the PBM reimburses the pharmacy. And so this is something that the states have been working on for a while, and it's been gaining traction in the administration and Congress. On the administration side, the FTC has been studying the role of PBMs in the industry for several years now. It began with a request for information, trying to get more information on the practices, as well as specific orders on the PBMs in the industries in 2022, 2023. And just, I think 3 weeks ago, they issued a comprehensive report, which resulted in Cigna's PBM Express Scripts suing the FTC over, what they allege are bias and false conclusions in the report. And just 3 days after Express Scripts sued the FTC, had their own lawsuit against some of these PBMs. for inflating insulin prices through what they allege are anti-competitive practices. And so this is something that's very much playing, in the legal field and the administration, and that will make its way to courts. But interestingly, also in Congress, this is something that a lot of the committees with jurisdiction have been studying. And that there's a lot of interest in potentially moving. And the reason for this, and we see it, the Lower Cost More Transparency Act has some PBM, and there's provisions, and there's also a very comprehensive PBM bills that have been introduced this Congress. Again, that would try to, either require disclosure of rebate or other information, or prohibit certain actions like the gag clauses or the spread pricing and the like. And the reason why this has gained a lot of traction is because it's estimated to save the government money. And so this is seen as a potential pay for other types of reforms. And so that is one of the reasons why this has been moving so quickly. But but I will say, at least in Congress, there is also a key question about whether there's right now existing authorities to regulate PBMs at the federal level. And so, again, while there's a lot of interest in moving a lot of this, especially by the end of the year in a potential end-of-year package, because it could pay for other reforms, more comprehensive type of legislation would likely wait until the next Congress or even beyond that. Next slide, please. Thank you. And with that, obviously, as you know, and Andy and Amanda mentioned, our colleagues work very closely on 340B specifically, but also more broadly on drug pricing. So at this point, I would love to turn it over to Amanda specifically to talk a little bit about 340B, which is, as you can imagine, not mentioned in either platform. Is too technical and too specific and in the weeds. But there's definitely, a lot of thoughts there. And also Andy, in case, Andy works so closely with hospitals on a lot of these drug pricing and PBM issues. So any comment or thoughts, Andy, also welcome at this point.
Thank you, Victoria.
I'll let Amanda go first. Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
All right, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Victoria. So as Victoria mentioned, 340B does not come up in either party's platform. But, the next coming months, you could see some 340B movement. So I really want to talk about lame duck and, the first couple of weeks and months of the 119th Congress, and specifically what I'm watching related to 340B. So over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talks about whether or not 340B needs reform and whether that should result in some comprehensive legislation completely changing the program. And you have some outlier bills that are either 100% provider asks or 100% manufacturer asks that have some support, but you really only have one bipartisan effort that has really been looking to move. And that's through what's referred to as the Gang of Six, which are 3 Republican, 3 Democratic senators who've been working throughout the 118th Congress to try to come up with some comprehensive 340B legislation. They have said that they want to get 340B legislation passed through lame duck, but they also said they were going to release the draft of that legislation before August recess, and that did not happen. So the odds of any comprehensive 340B reform happening in lame duck are very low. Just in that there's too much to do and it's too comprehensive. That's not to say it never could happen. It's just very unlikely 340B is going to come up specifically through that. It just doesn't seem like there's enough time to really get that to continue to move forward. But the election is breaking up the Gang of Six. So 2 of the Gang of Six are retiring, so will not be back. One is in a very tight re-election, so she may be back, she might not be. And then another is Senator Thune, who could take over a leadership role, which means he wouldn't, if he does become the Senate leader, if Republicans retake the Senate, he probably will not have much time to focus this much energy on 340B. He's going to have, much more on his plate that's going to be bigger and broader than 340B specifically. So 119th Congress, maybe you'll see a Gang of 2 or Gang of 3 continue on these efforts. Maybe you'll see some other senators join those efforts, or you might just see it fall apart and see kind of what happens next with any 340B momentum to pass 340B legislation. So, another big theme, I think, as if comprehensive 340B reform looks unlikely at this point, particularly until we see what kind of bipartisan effort regroups in the 119th, if nothing passes in the 118th. I think the other important key thing to watch is, as Victoria mentioned, PBM reform, because there are 340B pieces that can come up in PBM reform, particularly when it comes to Medicaid managed care. So your Medicaid managed care contracts, they can include where you actually have a little bit of a spread related to 340B use for Medicaid managed care. Most versions of PBM reform that are moving allow you to keep that spread, but have reporting requirements attached to it, which could require releasing some, pretty sensitive negotiated contractual information that you might have with the Medicaid managed care organizations. So that's something to watch if PBM reform continues to accelerate and continues to be a key issue that people are focusing. And then the other is appropriations. As Victoria put on the slides, you have your budget requests that have come up for both Republican and Democratic administrations. And an important thing on 340B is that the key 340B government players, they really aren't political. The folks that have been in charge now, that are in charge now, were in charge under Obama, under Trump, under Biden, and likely will be under the next president. They tend to ask in appropriations for a few things. And this year, it's probably going to be some sort of regulatory authority that they want to be able to limit patient definition in some way, or use of offsite locations known as child sites, maybe some regulatory authority related to contract pharmacy, and then user fees. They want more money. So that's 340B things that tend to come up every year through the budget justification process. And then just negotiating what ends up making it into that final document. They've never been granted those authorities, but they're still expected to ask for them. I could spend an hour talking about 340B, but that's probably enough for the purposes of this webinar. But I want to turn it over to Andy to make sure there's nothing that I didn't cover that he wants to cover.
Yeah, of course, Amanda. You did you covered the waterfront. So a couple of other points though regarding drug pricing. Many of you are probably aware of the kerfuffle regarding J&J having initially suggested that it was going to move to a rebate model, backing off of that, but they had a point that Amanda and I have talked about a couple of times in their letter, which was, hey, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act is still coming down the pike, and so we just want to point out that that the Inflation Reduction Act does affect providers, hospitals, even though it's a drug payment program, and you would think, well, that's going to affect pharmacies, not hospitals. Well, it affects your relationships with contract pharmacies. It affects when we start moving to Part B, as in boy, drug pricing negotiations, it's going to affect reimbursement on the Part B side. And so as the manufacturers make less money, and as the government imposes reimbursement limits on these drugs that are subject to these negotiations, you all are going to lose money. So you should actually, as an organization, be as against the IRA and its expansion as you possibly can, because hospitals absolutely are benefiting from drug payments, and so it's not to your benefit, quite frankly, for the government to impose more cost controls, because whatever they do to adversely affect manufacturers, they are also doing to lower reimbursement, and you directly get payment on the Part B side. And if they expand it to commercial, then that's going to crush your commercial infusion business as well. And as to contract pharmacies, obviously you get 340B savings, and that goes away. So you should be really cautious about about what you support that may seem like it's hurting the other side, but ultimately hurts ourselves. So that was the one point I thought was of value to understand understand on that front. So go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Andy. And again, we'll be opening it for questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So another key issue that you've probably been hearing a lot about is reproductive care broadly. And as you know, the federal and state governments have been grappling with the Supreme Court's decision in Dove's v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, where the Supreme Court held that the U.S. Constitution does not provide a right to abortion. And so obviously this has been front and center when it comes to discussions about the upcoming elections and what we can expect from an incoming administration. And Vice President Harris has placed reproductive rights generally at the forefront of her campaign and said that, if she were elected president, she would restore federal abortion protections and use executive power were available. Former President Trump, who had previously supported a federal abortion ban when president, has since shifted a little bit the stance on the issue and said publicly that he would not, that he would veto a federal ban. But in this regard, as you know, abortion and reproductive care is something that's really playing out right now at the state level. Most states today restrict abortion services, and this includes over 12 with total bans. And this is also something that's playing out in state ballots. There's, I think, almost 10 states that have this on their measures for November. And with states like Nebraska, which has competing dueling proposals on the issue. And even just, as you probably saw on the news just this week, this is also that's playing out in the courts. A 6-week abortion ban was just reinstated in Georgia, which is one of the key states that are going to decide the election. And this is after the state Supreme Court it halted a lower court's decision that would have struck down the state's ban. And so there's been several bills introduced in Congress on the Democratic side on the issue. Given the composition, none of this has moved, but this is something that we expect to continue to be in play. And not just when it comes to abortion, because as you probably also have seen, the debate over in vitro fertilization, IVF, has also been front and center in this debate, following the Alabama Supreme Court ruling that embryos created through IVF should be considered children. Since the Alabama decision, there's been a number of states that have introduced bills in this regard, and we have seen efforts at the federal level to try to pass bills that would protect a right to IVF. But again, this has not moved in the current Congress, but we expect a lot of these things to continue. Next slide, please. And before before I touch on the immediate legislative landscape, I'll say obviously these are just a couple of key issue areas, big picture key issue areas that we wanted to talk about, but there's obviously a lot more that could impact you. From a Harris administration, for instance, we know there's a big focus on medical debt and working with states to cancel medical debt and enact policies that would prevent debt in the future. A lot of this is work that started with the American Rescue Plan and the use of those funds to work with states in this regard. But there's been a lot of emphasis on that, and especially after CMS approved North Carolina's plan to relieve medical debt for people there. And so this is something that we'll also continue to watch and we'll continue to work on with you all. But I think now looking ahead, obviously we talked about big picture items, but I think the more interesting question is, given all of this, what could actually move and what can we expect in the immediate, term? And so, most immediately is the lame duck for us. and the focus will be on federal funding. As Amy mentioned, there was a continuing resolution that was signed recently that pushed the deadline until December 20th. And so right now, Congress is in recess, including a little picture of the congressional calendar. So as you can see, there's just not many legislative days left. When Congress returns on November 12th, they'll have roughly 5 weeks to act to avert a potential shutdown. And so the priority will be federal funding. And this is important for us because we are expecting a healthcare title, mostly because the COVID-19 telehealth flexibilities are expiring at the end of the year. And there's also a couple of other extenders that are going to be in play. And so, but as part of that, that's opening the door to other priorities to also be included. On telehealth, as you probably have seen from some of the action and the bills that have moved out of the committees, we are expecting a 2-year extension. While the Congress and the committees work on studying the potential impact of a permanent extension of those flexibilities, and also try to find a way to pay for that. But there's also a push to move, like I said, transparency legislation that could come in the form of something along the lines of the Lower Cost, More Transparency Act, and as well as, the PBM reform and some of the 340B measures, the street measures that Amanda touched on. But there's also, at least when I know those are key priorities for us, but when it comes to, whether this is something that could actually move, I will just say there are competing priorities right now. Behavioral health is one of them. There's a big push to move the Support Act, which needed to be reauthorized last September, but has not been reauthorized to date. That's a comprehensive opioid response legislation, and there's a big push to get that across the finish line by the end of the year. There's also been a renewed push to reform Medicare Advantage, and especially when it comes to prior authorization. You may have seen, there's this bill, the Improving Seniors Family Access to Care Act, that was introduced last Congress initially, and it would reform the prior authorization process and the like. Since then, there's been a number of regulations issued by the agencies with respect to Medicare Advantage and the prior authorization process, which slowed down movement on this bill, as well as because of its cost. However, the bill was just reintroduced this summer, and I don't think the CBO has scored this yet, but the sponsors of the bill are saying that it would cost $0 to move, and access to Medicare Advantage and removing limitations in the form of prior authorization procedures has also bipartisan support. So it is something that could potentially move as well. And the other thing that I was going to mention, because it could be, you probably also seen it, is with regards to physician pay. Physicians are facing, a pay cut for the fifth year in a row. CMS just proposed a 2.8% cut for 2025. Based on MACRA, the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act from 2015. As you know, this is an ongoing fight for the AMA. Every year they have been going to Congress to advocate for reform more broadly, but in the immediate short term, for Congress to reduce those cuts. And they have done it in the past. I think for 2024, they were facing a 3% cut to Medicare physician payments, which was reduced to 1.6%. And that is still something that the AMA is working on, especially now that the 2.81 has been proposed for 2025. The biggest hurdle right now is obviously the price tag for that. Just the short term, again, not the permanent one, just the short term solution would cost over $1 billion. And so again, it's one more thing that they would need to fund, but that could come as a form of like some of the extenders at the end of the year. And the reason why this is likely to gain some sort of traction is because Representative Bouchon, who's a member of the Doctors Caucus, is retiring. And, this is a key priority for him. It's has also become a key priorities for the Senate Finance Committee and for Chair Wyden, who just launched, a bipartisan task force that is aimed at exploring not just these short-term patches, but to just think about more broad permanent reform into the way physicians are paid. Again, a comprehensive reform is not likely by the end of this year, but they did release an RFI this year, and this is a priority for Senator Mark Warner, who is a member of this task force. And so to the extent, we can all be, of help in this regard and serve as a resource, this is something that will continue to be top of mind. Again, I think short term of this year, we can expect, if anything, this to come on as an extender. With a short-term solution, but we will continue the conversation next Congress. Next slide, please. And so this is for the rest of the year. And so I think the question now becomes, what can we actually expect for the 119 Congress, once Congress convenes, regardless of the composition of Congress? And the reality is that the ability to move a lot of these priorities is limited, and not just by the composition of Congress, but also just by set priorities that they will need to address when they all resume. When Congress convenes, the incoming president will have to work with Congress to avoid a government default. And this is in the first quarter of 2025, because under current law, on January 2nd, the debt ceiling is reimposed, and the government will need to adopt, extraordinary measures to avoid, some sort of default. And so this is going to give, Congress just just a short amount of time to raise the debt ceiling. The Fiscal Responsibility Act also instituted limits on discretionary spending for fiscal year 2024 and 2025, which means that Congress will also need to negotiate and agree on an amount for appropriations for the following fiscal years when those caps expire. And I think more significantly for our purposes is that key provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 are expiring. And right now, it is estimated that reauthorizing a lot of those provisions would cost over $1 trillion. And so this means that for us in healthcare, healthcare is usually seen as a potential pay for in a lot of things. And if Congress will work on reauthorizing a lot of these provisions, they'll be looking at ways to pay for that. And healthcare could be a part of that discussion. And again, this could come in the form of PBM reform, like Amanda mentioned. It could come in the form of site-neutral provisions, particularly the Cassidy bill that I just mentioned, that would seek to impose broad site-neutral reforms. And so it could come in the form of just cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, which would impact all of you. And so this is something to keep in mind. Even though the focus will be on tax and tax reform, it can very well impact the healthcare industry in as a means to pay for that. And again, I think what we can expect is also just continued oversight, and regardless of the composition of Congress and who's in the majority in each chamber. We expect continued scrutiny on tax-exempt organizations and hospitals specifically, and especially following, what's been happening with Steward Health. As you know, there's been an ongoing investigation into their bankruptcy, which originally stemmed over concerns over the use of private equity funding, and then just merged into quality of care concerns and others. And the Senate just recently passed a resolution holding their CEO, Ralph De La Torres, in contempt of Congress. And this came after the Senate Health Committee had voted in favor of a criminal contempt resolution that would direct the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia to prosecute De La Torre for failing to comply with the subpoena, as well as a civil contempt resolution, which is aimed at enforcing the subpoena and bringing him before the committee. Just this week, De La Torre filed his own lawsuit in federal court in D.C., naming the Senate Health Committee as a defendant, and I think 20 senators, and alleging that the Senate has violated his Fifth Amendment constitutional protections against government overreach and self-incrimination. And so this will continue, and it will continue to be front and center on the news, and it will continue to play out in Congress. And I think obviously this could have an impact on related oversight to hospitals and tax-exempt organizations more generally. And this is not just, I will say, not just on the congressional side. I mean, you probably all know that just this summer, the IRS said that they're expecting to be conducting a lot more audits to make sure that hospitals are complying with the regulations concerning the community benefit standard and a lot of the requirements concerning the same. And so again, this is something that we expect to be a continued focus next year. Next slide, please. And so on the regulatory side, we've seen a lot of action, especially in the beginning of this year because of the Congressional Review Act. And so the Congressional Review Act is a law that allows an incoming Congress to review the last 60 days of rules issued during the previous Congress. And, Congress can advance a resolution with simple majorities, but the president still needs to approve it and has a power to veto it. And so this really is a tool that comes into play, and it's most powerful whenever there's a change in administration, because that serves a tool for a new administration to disapprove of rules and issued under the last administration. And so obviously that all depends on the look back period of those 60 days, and which I think it was estimated to start in May this year. And so that's probably from the regulatory side. That's why a lot of the most controversial and comprehensive rules were tried to be issued prior to this, so that they would not be subject to a potential resolution of disapproval. And so this is just something that, it's good to have in mind and to keep in, as we start with the new Congress and see what they may be able to do on some of these regulatory priorities. Next slide, please. But I think also just for one of the most interesting developments, from a regulatory and judicial perspective is the potential impact of the Supreme Court's decision on local right. And I would love, our colleague Andy is an APA lawyer and works with a lot of hospitals. So I would love to, I would love for him to provide an overview of the case and just let you all know from the ground on, what he's seeing, how this is impacting hospitals, and what he's seeing on the regulatory side as a consequence of this.
Sure, happy to jump in, Victoria. So you most of you are probably familiar with Chevron deference. It was something that affected anyone's life who is trying to work with the government and trying to figure out how you can get the government to do what you want to do, and when they don't do what you want them to do, how you have rights to go after the government for failing to do what it should do. So Chevron deference goes all the way back to the early 1980s. It was actually a doctrine put forward by a court in a very conservative court during the Reagan administration, and it was considered to be a way to, for the conservative court to allow the Reagan administration to actually undo a lot of what very liberal judges had done for the prior decade, where the liberal judges were trying to overturn conservative decisions such as the EPA's decision to basically do nothing and the like. And this was a way to avoid the public interest groups from continuing to push cases that the conservatives disagreed with. But over time, the more liberal governments came into office, and they started using Chevron as a way to basically allow the executive branch to run wild. So the Supreme Court in this past term in the context of a case involving the Department of Commerce and rules regarding fishing, had used that as an opportunity to basically say, yeah, no, Chevron never made sense. It was never in line with the Constitution. It was never in line with the Administrative Procedure Act, which, by the way, is not even mentioned in that decision. And so, therefore, we overturn it and instruct the courts that they are now going to have to apply, as Victoria has highlighted in her slide, their independent judgment. And so this is already starting to have an impact in the courts. There was a decision in the D.C. Circuit about 3 weeks ago where an issue involving something called the low volume adjustment, which applies to Medicare dependent hospitals and sole community hospitals, was actually overturned at the D.C. Circuit, and it was the first of 8 decisions looking at that issue that finally ruled in favor of the provider community. It very expressly relied on Loper and said, we're now ruling in favor of providers because Loper says we have to look at things independently. We don't just put our finger on the thumb, our thumb on the scale in favor of Health and Human Services when we look at these laws. So I wrote a brief that I submitted yesterday, which was all about Loper, because the issue I'm writing about, and it's public, so I can tell you, if you have any teaching hospitals in your midst, and there are a number obviously in Virginia, you should all care about this case. We're basically challenging CMS's inclusion of labor and delivery beds in the interns and residents to bed ratio, which is a fundamental part of the indirect medical education adjustment. Back when CMS put that forward, they estimated this would cost teaching hospitals about $40 million. My own estimate is it's over $100 million now. And so your member hospitals should be protesting that item on their cost report and doing what they can to preserve their rights, because Loper does make it an easier case. Not easy, but an easier case for us. Now, what I was a speaker for HLA on the Loper decision recently, and I had with me a couple of other individuals, not all of whom were litigators. Some were, like Amy and Victoria, they do public policy. And so what was the most of the greatest interest for a lot of the audience was not the litigation aspects, but the fact that that you really do need at this point to have legislation that's clearer, because Congress may not read your legislation the way you want it to. They may not allow you to delegate certain responsibilities to the agency. You may have to do a lot of that on the front end, which means that that Congress is going to be talking to the Office of Leg Affairs within CMS a lot earlier than they had previously, because they're going to need to get very technical in their legislation. And so if you typically wait until CMS issues a rule before you get involved, you're now going to want to reach out to Amy and Victoria and others, much earlier, like when the legislation is being considered, because not only do you want to talk to Congress, but you want to talk to CMS so that the advice that they're giving on the technical side is reflective of what you need them to be putting into the legislation. So this changes everything from the birth of the law to the death of the law when people like me come along and challenge it. So that was all I have, Victoria.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andy. And yes, I mean, as Andy mentioned, one thing that's so interesting about the Loper decision is that obviously we're talking about it in the context of healthcare, but this is something that will impact all industries, and it has very consequential implications for the years to come, and not something that, I mean, we're talking about the impact that we've seen in a couple of months, and so it's something that we'll need to revisit next year. But one thing, as Andy mentioned, is on the congressional side, there will be more emphasis on being more prescriptive with legislation, which means, as Andy mentioned, there's going to be, more collaboration between congressional offices writing legislation and their agencies, but also more collaboration with the industry too, because at the end of the day, you're all the experts, and offices rely on you for a lot of this type of expertise. And so it's going to be critical to be able to provide that kind of feedback. And so going back to our priorities, when we're talking, where we're talking about Medicare or changes to site neutral, or we're talking about changes to physician pay, or we're changing changes to dish payments or the like, it's going to be important to get these done early and not wait until, a lot of this is addressed in regulation. But yes, I know we have a couple of minutes left. And so, Julie, I think we're done on our end with the slide. So we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, anybody have any questions? I don't know if Mark Duncan's still on. I thought he had one up initially, and I don't know if he did, but just wanted to check back in with him. He may not have. This is very thorough. I really appreciate it. Go ahead. Did somebody have something to say?
I'm sorry, Julie, it was answered. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good. Well done. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. We do have your slides. If we can share them with those on the call, we greatly appreciate it. Just to reiterate and to remind ourselves of the great nuggets that you have in here, particularly as we look to the lame duck session, but also into the 118th Congress. It sounds like it's going to be a wild one the next couple of months. So thank you for keeping us posted. Thank you for keeping us informed of all the various different things that are happening on the Hill as we look then now to transfer all of this knowledge and what we know into our state legislative process. So that will be here before we know it as well. So thank you guys so much for your time, Amy, Victoria, Andy, and Amanda. Really appreciate your expertise and allowing us to learn from you. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie and
Thank you.
team.
Thanks. Bye-bye.